Hello, juniors. I feel sad that we didn't get to meet last week, so I'm really looking forward to meeting with you guys this afternoon. Hopefully, everybody remembered. We'll find out. But nonetheless, the last time we were together, we were kind of going through Buddhism, and we spent a bit of time. So we've spent some time with Hinduism and Buddhism, and these, of course, are the two Eastern religions. Well, now it's time for us to take a look at the Abrahamic faiths. So what do I mean when I say the Abrahamic faiths? Well, I mean the faiths that come directly from the line of this man named Abraham. So I'm going to explain Abraham's life here as as we start to take a look at the Jews. But I want to, before we do that, just to let you know that Abraham story is something that's going to correlate not just to the Jewish people, but to the Muslims and Christians as well. So this week, we begin our foray into the Abrahamic faiths by looking at the oldest one. We're going to look at Judaism. Now, Judaism, as this is remember, this is supposed to be a class on world religions, so religions that are celebrated and believed around the world. And the Abrahamic, or excuse me, oftentimes there's a little bit of confusion as to why we would include Judaism on that list. And let me just be perfectly frank. There are very few Jews in comparison to the other religions, by a lot. The number of people who claim to be Jewish in the world is probably somewhere around less than 1%. Whereas when you're looking at Islam, you're looking at 25%. And you're looking at Buddhism, you're looking at 7 or 8%. I mean, so there's a lot of people who believe the other faiths that we're talking about, and there's not as many Jews as there are of any of these other ones. So why are we looking at a faith when we have other faiths that we're not studying that are larger? The answer is actually quite simple. The Jewish faith, more than any other, has had a massive impact on the faith of the whole world. I mean, remember that we're talking about the Abrahamic religions. Well, Judaism is the oldest one. So Judaism is the root of both Christianity and of Islam, which are two of the two mammoth religions in the world. So with how many people are Christian and how many people are Muslims, having a good understanding of their root of Judaism is just fundamentally wise. But beyond that, the Jews are interesting and important in their own right, because for many reasons, which we'll get into as we go through these couple of lessons on Judaism. Let me start by saying straight out, there is absolutely no way that we're even going to be able to brush, even with the broadest strokes, Judaism throughout the world. There's no way. It's way too massive. The history, the amount of time that we're talking about is literally like, how long has civilization been around? I mean, it's ridiculous how impossible a task this is. So let's not pretend for a moment that that's what we're going to do. We're not. This is not going to be even an overview. This is not even going to be a summary. This is going to be the most basic foray into the most general things that really is not even going to begin to express what the Jewish understanding of the world is. This is the oldest major faith that we have, and it is it's just not simple. So, but let's do what we can. The first thing to note is I'm going to do this video. We're going to do this in two parts. The first part, I'm going to look at Judaism from the beginning, from its beginnings with Abraham to all the way to the end of the Temple era. So this is thousands of years we're going through here, and we're going to be going through it at great speed. There's literally no way we can do this. Let's stop saying that and let's do what we can do. Judaism begins with a man named Abraham. Now, Abraham was born in what we now would call Mesopotamia, in a city called Ur. And God called him to live a life that was separate from his people. And so what he did is he followed God. God literally spoke to Abraham in some way. And Abraham therefore took him and his whole family and lived a nomadic lifestyle in the deserts of the Middle East, moving around a great deal. He never really stopped moving. A good way of thinking of this would be looking at the modern Bedouin. Um, just kind of they're people who live traveling with their flocks, going from place to place. Now, Abraham was special in that because God was speaking to him in this direct way, he responded in faith, doing what God told him to do. Now, God would insinuate that he wanted him to do things, and Abraham just did it. He just trusted God. He had faith in God. And so we call him our father in faith. And in return, God gave him a promise. And the promise was this, that Abraham would become the father of nations, the father of nations. And as such, he didn't experience that during his life. He had one son. His name was Isaac. Um, we could talk about Abraham all day long. But Abraham has this one son, and this one son is the son from whom all the Jewish people say they are descended from. Now, that's not entirely true. Abraham actually had two sons. He had one son by his wife and one son by his wife's maidservant. And the son that's from his wife's maidservant, by the way, is the people that Islam call their father. But regardless, this Isaac. So Isaac has a son as well, and Isaac's son is named Jacob. So these three people are called the patriarchs, and these three people are the beginnings of the Jewish story. I wish we had time to go. I could spend a whole semester doing nothing talking about but just Abraham, but we can't. So this is the root. Now, these three people, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all inherit they all receive the same promise from God, that God is going to somehow grant their family to be the family that's going to be a light to the nations, that's going to be that's going to show the truth to the world. Let's put it that way. So Jacob has 12 children, and these children, no, yeah, don't worry about that. Out of Jacob comes 12 tribes. So imagine that each one of his family, and it's not just him, it's actually one of his kids has, never mind. Let's not make it complex. There's 12 tribes that come from Jacob. So we have Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob, and then we have these 12 families. And these 12 families are what we call the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay? So the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, through history and through a chance, well, no, not through chance. Actually, let's do this a different way. The Jewish people, one of the ways they like to think of God is the God of history. The God of history. In other words, the God that moves and shapes time. Like all the experiences that you and I go through, God shapes those, right? And so when we look at history, we can see the movements of God throughout history. So what we see in this early time, we see God setting a stage. He's creating a place, and he's creating this people. He's separating them apart. So he moves them to the land of Egypt, and in Egypt they become slaves. So these people are now growing in number. Remember, they went from 12 tribes, 12 families, and now these families are becoming very, very big. And now they're living in Egypt. But because they're in Egypt, they're not in their home. They don't really have a home country. So the Egyptian people enslaved them to build their monuments, to do their work for them. Here comes the most important figure in all of Jewish history, the figure of Moses. So Moses was one of these Israelites. And one of the things that the Egyptians did is they had all to try and quell the numbers of Jewish people, they 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 would kill off the children. Well, Moses somehow escapes this, and he ends up being raised in the royal household. All sorts of things happen, but he comes back to set his people free. God speaks to him and calls him, not unlike Abraham was called. Moses is now called, and Moses comes to Egypt with great power, the power of God behind him. And with this, all God works all of these miracles in Egypt to help set the people of the Jewish people free, and they are set free. And this freedom ends with them walking, wins through this miraculous walking through the sea, and with them spending this time in the desert. Now, I wish I had the time to go through the whole story of Moses because it's their root story. But the key thing to remember is that Moses speaks with God and God speaks to Moses. And so Moses is able to communicate to everything that the Jewish people need to, that the Israelites need to know. So while they're in the desert, God speaking through Moses helps form these people into not just a, I mean, let's be honest, these people are they've been living as slaves in another land. They're not well educated. They're not they're not they're just people. And God begins to shape them through their time in their desert. God gives them law. He gives them order. He tells them his ways. He takes care of them. He feeds them. He gives them he takes care of their needs. He challenges them. And most of the time they fail those challenges. This, more than anything else, I think is the absolute most beautiful thing about Jewish history. Is Jewish history over and over and over again recognizes that God has been faithful to them and they have failed in that. They're the most honest, some of the most honest ancient literature you'll ever read. Frankly, today we still have trouble with this kind of honesty. And the Jewish people are just, they tell it like it is. God helped us, and we sucked at that, which is true. Me and you and all of us, we all are terrible at this, right? And they recognize that, but God forms them anyway, and eventually leads them to a place called the Promised Land. We call this modern place Israel after the Israelites, but they were promised a land and they were promised a people. And as they move into this land, they're still directly governed by God. So they're living as tribes, all throughout this new space, this new land, and as situations come up that need help, or that they need to be gathered, God would raise up someone to be able to help all the tribes. We call these people the judges, and this time frame we call it the time of the judges. So God would keep bringing these people up, but as they were needed. But there's a problem. And the problem's this: all the other kingdoms around them had a king, and they wanted to have a king they wanted to be like a real kingdom, not just like a bunch of people living out, trying to follow God. They wanted to be a nation, and so God allowed it. God allowed them to have a king, and their first king wasn't the best king ever. He started out fine, but it went downhill rapidly, and very soon he wasn't worshiping God the way God wanted to be worshiped, and he was worshiping other gods too, and he was all sorts of weird things were going on. But eventually he's replaced by a man named David. And David is the first and really the only Jewish king who really, really tried to follow God's heart. And so for the Jewish people, this is a beautiful and powerful time, a time of great glory, when the Jewish nation was really its own nation. And so for them, God and country, you were woven together into one beautiful fabric. And so this time called the Davidic kingdom, there's this great kind of growing. And in this time, we start seeing the beginnings of them really starting to codify all they do. Now, God has been with them all this time, most especially and through the presence of this incredible artifact called the Ark of the Covenant. It was a special golden box, and with this golden box, the presence of God would be with them. Well, David's son, Solomon, um, decided that it was time for this golden box to be held in a temple. And so he built a temple, a beautiful, glorious temple. And this temple became the center of everything it meant to be an Israelite. The people would come from everywhere to worship and do sacrifices and follow the law there. So this temple was where God's presence really was. And so their whole life circled around this temple. This temple was in a place called Jerusalem. It's in Jerusalem, is in the center of Israel. And Abraham himself went to Jerusalem before it was a city. So this place is a very, very special, special place. And so for the Jewish people, this place was the most important thing to them. That this is where they could come to meet God. This is where they could come to fix their relationship with God. This is where they could come to offer God things. This was the center of everything. Sadly, as the years roll on, they became less and less faithful until a terrible thing happened. The Jewish people would recognize that whenever they were not faithful, that God would censure them, that he would give them, he would do something, he would allow something to happen to them that would remind them of their importance, that they were called to be his. And they had really fallen away from that. And so what happened was the Jewish people were overtaken. And in a great war, all of the Jewish people were moved, or at least especially the higher, families of the Jewish people were moved to a place called Babylon, which was far away. So they were ripped away from their homeland. And being ripped away from their homeland um, became an incredibly important event for them. This solidified them as a country in a strange way. For they weren't gone for like 5 years; they were gone for a generation, right? And because of this, suddenly they were strangers in a strange land, and they weren't able to do the same things. They were moved away from that temple that was so important. The temple was destroyed. They they didn't have the life that like everything was taken from them, and so because of this, they realized how important it was. So when they were finally set free and came back to Jerusalem, they came back to their homeland. Um, they looked at their faith, at their Jewish faith, with a newfound vigor and great excitement. And they tried to really live out all the commands that God had left them. They became very focused on the laws that were given to them, and they began to really that this is when the religion became something, went from being something organic to being something very organized and very serious, because they really wanted to hold that heritage. They wanted their identity. However, there were some problems. One of the major problems being just the world at the time. Um, the Greek uh, the Greek armies of Alexander the Great had come through and had taken over Israel, including them, and were forcing them to try and break these new rules that they had just finally gotten their faith back, and now the this new world of the Greeks was forcing itself upon them. So we have a time of revolts. We have the Maccabean revolt, for example. We have a time of people hiding in the desert. All sorts of things are going on because they're really trying to hold on to their heritage. And this moves all the way into the Roman. The Romans eventually begin to occupy Israel, and this too is a problem for the same reasons that the Greeks were. They're really not letting them rule themselves, and they really want their nation back. They want their homeland to really just be theirs again. They were promised this land by God, and they were promised this place by God, and they were supposed to be the promised children of God. And so, well, they this is This is their whole struggle. So we see throughout Judaism this identity of community. We see this incredibly powerful identity of them as a nation. We see this incredibly strong relationship of them as the chosen people, that God has chosen them to be in a special way in relationship with them. So to some degrees, Judaism is very ethnic focused. Like, we're Jews, God chose us. We're going to live that out. And that's the way it was all the way up into this first temple. Sadly, this doesn't go well. Eventually, the riots and the revolts and the fighting and the anger, Rome decides they're going to wipe them off the map, and so they come and they destroy their last temple, and they absolutely decimate the Israelite people. They scatter them. Most of the people went back. A great number of them went back to Babylon, but a great number of the Jewish people were spread out throughout the world, trying to find a new place to live because their homeland was taken away from them. We call this time period the diaspora, and we're going to spend a lot of time. The rest of our next class will all be about the diaspora. But I want you to notice that God is working through the Jewish people through history, that He's the God of history. So for them, everything that happens to them is something that God is willing for them and something that they're trying to live out. So as we look next week, we'll start to look at from that ancient time into our modern times. But hopefully that gives you a good general idea. We're looking at the God of history, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and how this chosen people were given a chosen land, and that they were called to live out their faithfulness to God. And whenever they did, things went well. And whenever they didn't, things went poorly. Looking forward to seeing you guys next week. God bless you.